Hey guys, I'm David Benitez and this is Extreme Vocal Institute. Today I'm going to be answering questions from members of our free Facebook community group, so stick around and keep watching for some useful vocal information and demonstrations as well. For lung capacity, there are different types of breathing exercises you can do, but your ability to sustain different tones for different amounts of time is all dependent on your ability to then control that air and then use it. For example, when you're breathing, if you want to work on expanding your overall capacity, one thing I have people do is take in a nice, slow, deep breath, as deep as you can, and then take 3 additional sips on top of that. Hold it for a second, and then let it out. And then do that about 4 or 5 times. One, that'll give you a nice energy boost before something like a rehearsal or a recording session or a performance. But what this will also do is it will steadily increase your ability to stretch and expand as you breathe, which will in turn over time create more space for air to fill up in all of these different cavities that we're using to expand. So again, nice deep breath. 3 sips. Hold. And release. Now for being able to get more sustain control, what you want to do is really feel your ability to create consistent air pressure. For example, you don't want to just let your air fall out of your body when you're doing this stuff, because then all of the air just comes out at once and it's not going to really be effectively used for anything. Instead, what you can do is, example, create a loud hissing sound like so. When you create that sound, it creates the feeling of air pressure here in the diaphragm. You can feel this deeper internal push. Then, hiss at a softer volume. What you'll notice is even though the sound is significantly lessened, the feeling of the pressure is still very much there. So working on these hissing exercises at different speeds can help you feel varying degrees of air pressure. Example, I'll do a louder hiss for about 10 seconds. Or I'll do a softer hiss for 15 to 20 seconds. And you can work on feeling your ability to keep that pressure consistent. The way that translates over is you'll feel your ability to gauge how much pressure to use when you're creating a different kind of vocal. For example, when you're trying to hold something for a longer period of time, you want to scale back on the amount of air pressure so you can make the air you have last as long as you need it to without backing off so much that then the power is gone. You want to make sure there's still enough there to be the support for the tone you're trying to create. In addition, it's also best to scale back on overall volume when you're going for sustain. This will free up the real estate for you to back down on the pressure a little bit and work on just keeping the tone consistent as you're holding it. In the example of a sustained note, I'm going to back off of the air pressure from what I might normally do on a shorter attack to be able to balance it differently and hold it for longer. The difference between ah and being able to hold it for longer because I'm changing the amount of pressure I'm using, but I'm keeping that pressure consistent throughout the sustain. If the pressure were to kind of go in and out, like I were feeling like I were having to push a little more, a little less, and it wasn't consistent, you'll get kind of that fluttery wavering sound. Similarly, with your metal vocals, especially for the larger, more open-throated ones, the air is going to be coming out of your system faster. So you really want to make sure you're balancing extra carefully to make sure you're not running out of air all at once. Example, with a shorter attack, yeah, I'm using a certain amount of air pressure. That's based on my own body and the sound that I'm trying to create. Now I'm going to scale back on that and sustain the sound for longer. Yeah. So you can hear that the intensity went down a little bit, but even though I only lost a little there, what I gained was the ability to sustain that sound for a longer period of time without it wavering, like so. You want to avoid that type of inconsistency by really working to balance all of these things together to sustain these tones, not just for as long as you can, but for the specific amount of time you need to. Generally, I tend to, both myself and with my students, keep people away from inhale vocal techniques just because of the damage that they can do and the fact that you end up with a lot more cons than you do pros with those kinds of styles. For muting a vocal, if you're talking about getting a different type of vocal quieter or being able to hold back on tone, again, that comes down to balance. Not just for the style of vocal you're speaking of, but for any style of vocal in general. You want to be able to pull back the amount of overall effort you're putting into the sound while still giving it just enough to sustain the sound. For example, I can make a louder metal vocal sound, ay, yeah. But if I scale back, yeah, 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 yeah. See how I backed off a little too much there and the sound started to dissipate? I'm going to bring it back a little bit now. Yeah. Now I essentially get the same overall sound as the first one. Yeah. But I've scaled back enough, and now I've been able to reduce the volume ever so slightly. Yeah! This is good in terms of being able to get the difference between what you might do in the studio and what you would do live, in terms of your ability to get these very intense sounds out, but in a way where you're more evenly dispersing your energy throughout a whole set, versus when you're in the studio and you do one take and you can more so afford to give that take all you've got because you can then rest for a few moments afterwards, whereas on stage you can't. So for lower guttural and lower metal vocal sustain in general, like I mentioned before, these are normally more open-throated, wider shaped sounds. So naturally, just through common sense, if there's more space, the air is going to travel through that space faster than it would if the space were smaller. So you want to make sure that everything through your upper respiratory system here is nice and big and open and relaxed, so you can get the maximum amount of tone with the minimal amount of force. That'll make it so you can actually back off enough to sustain the power of the sound, but not need to push so hard just to get there in the first place, if that makes sense. Now, on top of that, the smaller a shape you can create with the mouth and the face, the deeper those tones are going to be perceived, even though they're based on the more open mouth ones as well. Example, I'll go from an open mouth sound to a closed mouth sound. The only difference there being the mouth shape. Now, with all the different kinds of gutturals and different lower screams out there, all of that variation just comes from different types of jaw placement and tongue placement and the different things we're doing with the upper part of the throat. Example, how much or how little of the pharynx you're using at any given moment and how much of this type of hourglass shape you're playing with. Now, for a lower kind of standard guttural, if you're going for like the quick approach, you'll notice that that has a lot of punch to it, but I didn't hold it for very long. So now I need to scale back. I backed off too much. And again, just like with the other examples, the sound dissipates. So now I've kind of figured out where that sweet spot is and what backing off too much feels like. I'll do it again. It's somewhere here in the middle I need to be aiming. Now I'm going to try and get there directly. Now I've kind of found that middle ground that enables me to sustain that sound for longer. There are other types of lower vocals that can be held for longer because of the way we're getting there. For instance, if you are someone that enjoys kind of the tongue behind the top front teeth approach, it creates a slightly different overtone, but because of the way it's shaped, you're able to hold it for longer because the air isn't coming out of your system nearly as quickly. So that type of style, if balanced appropriately, can actually be scaled back quite a lot without losing the sound. Regardless of who you want to sound like, because everyone has like their list of different vocalists and singers that they aspired to be like and sound like, especially when they first started getting into this type of music and these types of vocal styles, it's important to understand that everyone only has the tools that they have. And although emulation is definitely possible through the amount of like flexibility and the amount of different distortion shapes we're able to create, and just as human beings, our ability to emulate other sounds we hear, that's just how we learn to communicate in general. It's important to understand that everybody at their core is going to have their very own, very unique sound. So when you're learning to do this stuff on your own, or if you're someone who's been doing this for a while, who's looking to expand on your abilities, although it's good to look to others for inspiration, you never want to get too focused on trying to get someone else's sound, because it's a lot better to embrace what you already have and then bend that into the kind of directions you want to go in. And then you'll be much happier with your end results. So this is Green Leaf. I'm gonna listen to this real quick. Green leaves. Spinach, that's a green leaf. Kale, that's also a green leaf. If you peel a Brussels sprout apart, does that count as green leaves? I'm not sure. Ooh. That's really full. I like that. You can hear the depth in the recording too, which I like, because normally you can't. So, just after just a really quick listen, what I kind of gather from the Green Leaves sound, I don't know their vocalist name off the top of my head, but it sounds like they're creating an awful lot of space here in the throat. So the larynx is being lowered ever so slightly. And that, like for instance, if I'm yawning, takes my voice from here to about here. And when you're talking about metal vocals and the amount of different overtones and distortion being put into that, little changes like that are going to make a much bigger difference. On top of that, we're creating a very tall shape, both with the muscles of the face and the jaw. So instead of just like a standard vocal, I'm going to elongate, but in a relaxed way. Here, getting lower. Now I'm kind of keeping the tongue straight because I'm hearing the tone being curved ever so slightly. So I'm curving my own tongue to kind of match that. And when you combine that with the throat, you get that similar lower tone. Now, it takes time, but after you start getting really familiar with what you have yourself, you can do things like I just did and listen to others and kind of hear what's being used to create those types of sounds because of listening to what different types of shapes make certain sounds with your own voice, and then essentially reverse engineer from there? That's actually a really good question, because that's a very different answer for everybody, and it's a very different situation depending on the amount that you're talking about. If you're genuinely concerned, feel free to get in touch with us directly and send us examples of what you're speaking about, and we can get more specific about your specific concerns. Now, in general, with any kind of metal vocal, all we're talking about is varying degrees of overtones and the way we're controlling those overtones. For all of these different types of vocals that we talk about here, all of them, to some degree, involve the use of the vocal cords. Even the ones that use less or more, they're never just totally deactivated. So, to that token, all screams are pitch-based, which is why I always say melodic warm-ups are the best way to go when you're prepping your voice for what you're going to be doing, regardless of the style, because it's the only way to get in here and actually relax everything and work it the way you need to properly and healthily prepare yourself to be able to create these sounds in a safe and productive way. Now, with this question, all vocals are a different balance of how much of the vocal cord you're hearing versus how much of the distortion or the overtone play you're hearing. And different types of vocals get their distortion and their overtones by different methods, but the vocal cord is always there. So it's always this balancing act. For instance, when I'm going for a lower type of vocal, you can hear that it's predominantly overtone based. All of that kind of fire crackling kind of sensation you hear inside of there. I feel like I look like a little bit like a magician right now. That's the overtones going. Now, if I scale back on the amount of distortion, you're going to start to hear more of the actual true phonation inside of that sound. So there is pitch inside of there. And it's important to recognize that, because that doesn't always mean it's a bad thing by any means. So if you are intentionally trying to get a more pitched type vocal, hear how I'm kind of moving around my range. I can go to different areas and allow some of that pitch to shine through intentionally. As long as it's a choice, that's how you can tell it's healthy. If you're balancing it that way intentionally and scaling the amount of work you're doing to be able to compensate for the amount that's going into the sound and the amount of actual things going on within the mechanisms responsible for this sound. So if you're letting the pitch shine through your vocal, it's important to balance appropriately. Even for something that's way more clean than scream, ya versus ya. You can hear that little bit of overtone there. Ya! Or if I increase it even more, ya! You can hear that I'm increasing the overtones, but the pitch is still there. But with the minimum amount of overtones, ya! Ya! You still get a lot of pitch, and then it's essentially just colored by the overtones. And I'm balancing all these different things depending on what I'm going for, and I'm either increasing or decreasing depending on what I'm doing. So, in conclusion, you want it to be a choice. If you want your vocals to be more on the distorted side, more on the evil, less distinguishable side, go for more overtones and balance appropriately once you get there. If you want more of that human element and more of that pitch that shines through the sound, then back off of the sound and allow the overtones to die down, and then keep calm as the pitch shines through, and you'll be able to balance it much more safely and effectively. here's a disclaimer. Another tip for when you're looking at other people's voices to try and figure out how to do that yourself. Always understand when you're listening to a record, there are always other things going on that you can't typically normally tell unless you're someone very heavily involved in this type of work where you can hear these little things like different amounts of compression, different amounts of distortion put onto sounds after the fact, just because that's a very modern thing to be able to get the vocals to shine through a mix in the appropriate way so you can actually hear everything with all the other noise going on. You want to listen for what's organic and what's not. With that example you gave us, there is the slightest bit of distortion added to the sound after the fact. So there's bits of the crackling sensation and bits of that piercing sound that aren't necessarily replicatable. And that's not to say that you can't make the sound, and that's not to say that the original person is unable of making that sound either. It's just going to sound slightly different than what you might expect it to. With that type of vocal, it's much less about incorporating head voice and more so about the amount of pinch there is in the upper part of the pharynx. Now, the pharynx, as I've mentioned before, is everything above in this upper part of the throat that happens after the larynx here, where my Adam's apple is. Whoop. There we are. So, and you have the lower part of the pharynx in the throat. You have the middle section of the pharynx, which is around the mouth area. And then you have the nasal pharynx. And if I switch around those different areas, you can hear the way the tone changes. Now, we can create various amounts of specific tension and specific shape variation in these areas, and that's kind of what's creating that sound. Now, for the very high-pitched fry sound, yes, you do want to incorporate head voice, and you want to do that the same way you would just get to head voice in general, which is just allowing the voice to go there by itself. This isn't something you can force or something you can muscle through and manipulate to get up there. As you're moving up in your voice, you want to let it just go there, because everyone does have this. If you're not used to getting up there, it might be a bit shaky. Example, you might notice it get kind of whispery, kind of shaky, and that's just because you're not used to getting there in general this way, which is okay. You can use various melodic warm-ups to teach yourself over time how you can essentially get out of your own way and allow yourself to get into this area of your voice. Now, when you incorporate that with the fry vocal, you essentially want to go to a higher note in your voice. Start the fry vocal from there. And then use additional pharynx pressure to bend the sound upward. Now, this very pinchy style is something that I don't typically do, which is why mine goes up to a degree. I'll start from an even higher note to see if I can get close. So I can get high to a degree, but I'm not getting to the same sound that you're referencing because I'm not relying on as much tension to get there. Now, using that kind of pinchier approach to get to these vocals isn't necessarily bad for you as long as it's a very specific amount and you're very careful about it and you're balancing it appropriately. And then, just like with everything else, consistency is key. As long as you're consistent in the way you're getting there and you're not very inconsistent in terms of overdoing it or underdoing it at any given time, it can be safer. But, disclaimer, generally if a sound does rely on tension, more often than not, it is something that you want to steer clear of, in which case you can get to similar sounds by various other alternatives. Additionally, like I've mentioned already in this video, everybody's voices are different. We're all operating with a different toolbox here. So one person's voice might be generally higher pitched than another's, or yours, for instance. So when you're listening to someone else's voice, you want to think about how they're shaped, how high-pitched their voice actually is. Think about what their speaking voice is like. Think about if they're also someone that sings, what you've heard them be able to do, and usually, more often than not, that does relate directly to their ability to get into these higher tones. Even though everyone has a head voice, what that means is different for everybody, and where each person transitions into head voice is going to be different because everybody's range is different. So when you are even doing the same exact types of muscle movements and combining all of the same structures that someone else is, your end result is going to be different than theirs because you're not them and they are not you. So they're going to sound different, and if you want more of one thing or less of one thing and you want it to change, think about how you can balance your way into there and manipulate your way to that sound. If you aren't able to get that type of very intense higher shriek, for example, when I did a very similar thing, my voice did not go to the same place. You heard that yourselves. So if you're unhappy with the sound, think about ways you can kind of manipulate your way up there and very safely and gradually make your way up there. But it's important to understand that you want to accept what you do have available to you as well. In terms of high screams in general, depending on the style, there is, like you can hear in mine, a lot of throat noise, and there's a lot of that mid and low end in there. Again, so when that's being done in context with music, a lot of the same frequencies that are in the electric guitar and in the bass and in the drums and especially the cymbals are the same and occupy the same space that lower end of the high scream lives in. So when you hear them combined with each other, all of the music and all the other sound kind of eats away at those frequencies. So what you're left with is just the very piercing, high-pitched sound. I'll add some sort of sound in here to demonstrate. Here's without. Here's with. So when you have the addition of sound, you only hear the parts that are going to shine through those frequencies because they're not also being created. So when you're listening to this type of stuff on record and live, understand that when someone else is going through their higher vocals, their higher pitched screams, that doesn't mean there isn't low end to them. And when you're doing them on your own, if there is low end in there, that doesn't mean it's wrong either. It's just understanding that doing it solo and doing it with music are totally different things. Distortion is a very, very, very broad term. Like I've mentioned in other parts of this same video, there are many different types of distortion, and every single type of vocal out there requires a different combination of shape variation and different things touching and different things staying away from each other and different amounts of air pressure and different things working together to create the overtones and the shapes that you're hearing in the sound with whatever singer you're listening to and whatever band you're listening to as well. So for overall distortion, just like with everything else, my main piece of advice is to always balance the overall amount of effort you're putting in with the maximum amount of sound. So trying to get the most you can with the minimum amount of effort and trying to balance those things like you saw me do earlier in this same video. Now, with different styles, for example, the hyperglottal attack, which is something I did earlier with being able to get a slightly heated sung note, ma versus ma. For me, that is the pharynx and lower part of the pharynx coming together ever so slightly. That's just one style. The closer together I get, the more distorted it is. Ah, 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 ah. And you can hear it getting more distorted. With false chord vocals, obviously that's the use of the false chords themselves, in combination with the vocal cords themselves. And again, I'm relaxing my way into that. with any type of fry vocal, you have the combination of the fry register of your voice and combining that with the upper head voice to create more intensity and more projection. To be able to create different sounds that way. Now, even though those two examples are different mechanisms, it still requires the same kind of balance. And there are way more than that as well. There are so many different types of distortion used for different purposes, and they're all using various things in the throat, and it's all different combinations of what the vocal cords are doing, how much pharynx or how little pharynx, if the false cords are used versus they're not, if you're in head voice, if you're in chest voice, if you're getting all this hand resonance, if you're coming from underneath in the chest on purpose. There are many different versions of this, and all of them have their own very unique answer. So my top recommendation for this, again, is when you're looking into different styles of distortion, which all of this falls under that category, by the way. When you're looking into different types of distortion, always be balancing the maximum amount of sound with the minimum amount of effort, and you'll be able to safely navigate your way through distortion. And there you have it. If you guys at home still have vocal questions of your own, drop them in the comments here in this video or join our free Facebook community group. Thanks for watching and scream responsibly. Sick.